So one of the questions I get asked often is how ballot initiatives can impact the election, right? So in Florida and Arizona, we have abortion ballot initiatives. Could that actually swing the election in Kamala Harris's favor, or maybe even some of the US Senate races or congressional races as well? So in today's video, we are going to be talking about the impact that those might have on turnout and possibly partisanship by looking at some scholarly writings on the topic. So that is the focus of today's video. But if we look at it at face value, we might see that there really isn't too much evidence at face value. Let me go ahead and show you 2020 in the state of Florida. So if we see in 2020, we see that the ballot initiative to increase the minimum wage passed overwhelmingly in the state. However, Donald Trump actually won the state in the presidential election. And if we look at the down ballot drop-off, we see over 500,000 voters decided not to vote on the minimum wage amendments, but did vote in the presidential election, showing that this probably didn't drive anyone at all to vote for either Joe Biden or Donald Trump, because the numbers aren't right and you actually see down ballot drop off. So as in Florida and other states as well, we see this contradiction between what we expect the reality is with the initiative and what vote choices in partisan elections. It doesn't always necessarily be correlated with each other. So the first time that this really came up was back in 2004 when George Bush won the presidency, with also anti-gay marriage initiatives on the ballots in many states. And a lot of people said that that probably influenced the vote to help George Bush win the election. Now, let's go ahead and look at some of the studies that had been done about that a few years after the election to see what they say. So when we go ahead and look at Kabula in 2008, when it comes to turnout and referendums, he clearly states, using cross-sectional analysis for the 50 states for the 2004 general election, this study finds that the existence of initiatives and or referenda does not significantly influence voter turnout. Kimmel and Croft also add to this in 2006, saying, we examine residual votes on ballot issues and the presidential contest in 34 states that had propositions on the ballot in the 2004 election. We find that residual votes levels for ballot issues are substantially higher and more varied than for the presidential contest. Now, when it comes to specific partisanship itself and how initiatives might influence it, Daniel Smith from the University of Florida here in 2005 looked at the Ohio election in 2004 and looked at how the same-sex marriage ban impacted the vote in the state. His conclusions found the following. The findings from the county-level data, however, reveal that the measure to ban same-sex marriages did not act as a partisan wedge issue. After controlling for other relevant factors, counties with large proportions of African Americans and Catholics did not vote for issue 1 any more or less than other counties. While Republican-leading counties, as expected, strongly supported issue 1, those counties with higher proportion of evangelicals were no more likely than other counties to support the ballot measure. So 2004 is usually this case study that we have to talk about how the vote changed and how George Bush won because of these initiatives, but the evidence out there just doesn't seem to back that up. It just seems to be scant at best, and when testing for it, we just don't see much. However, there have been studies throughout political science about turnout and initiative. So let's go ahead and look at some of those studies to get an idea of where the literature right now lies. So Tolbert and Smith in 2005 went ahead and looked at the impact of ballot initiatives on just overall turnout. In their research, they state the following: we analyzed the impact of ballot initiative use on voter turnout from 1980 through 2002 using voter-eligible population turnout rates. Cross-sectional time series analysis reveals that a ballot initiative increased turnout in midterm as well as presidential elections, and the turnout effect in midterm and especially presidential elections is considerably larger than previously thought. On average, turnout in presidential elections increases by 0.7% with each initiative on the ballot, whereas in the midterm elections increases by 1.7%, all else equal. Given the closeness of the Electoral College contest, it's possible that the mobilization effect of statewide ballot questions could be the determining factor in future presidential elections. Now, this research mentions something I think is really interesting, and we'll be hearing it throughout the other research that we look at, which is that these ballot initiatives seem to impact more the midterm elections than the presidential elections. Now, chances are why this is you probably already have a high turnout in presidential elections. So therefore, you're not necessarily bringing somebody new into the fold as far as voting. But when it comes to midterm elections where voter turnout can be lower, you might have more of a problem with turnout. Now, before we go on to the next thing, a lot of you are not subscribed to the channel. Please subscribe to the channel. We're trying to get up to 20,000 before the end of this election cycle. So please hit the little bell if you like what you have on here. And please, if you're interested in being a member and supporting the channel out financially, go ahead and join. Now, back to the science research. A few years later in 2010, Biggers went ahead and studied basically the same thing. And in his findings, he says, quote, "I find that the number of social issues on the ballot, because they are higher salient, tap into existing social cleavages, help to overcome barriers to voting, and fit within the framework of expressive choice, had positively impacted the turnout in all midterm and some presidential elections since 1992. In contrast to previous findings, however, the total number of propositions on the ballot was rarely associated with an increase in turnout. I discussed the implication of these findings in the conclusion." So this goes back to what Tolbert and Smith were talking about before, where as the more and more initiatives have, the more you see an increase in turnout. In this situation, Biggers says he doesn't see that correlation at all. So Childers and Bender back in 2016 also studied this issue as well as far as turnout and ballot initiatives. And they conclude that, like previous studies, we find that ballot propositions fail to significantly affect turnout in presidential elections over time, but do during midterm elections. So one of the criticisms I get when I push back on this idea of the ballot initiatives actually impacting the vote are young people. So I will get a lot of people down below say, my children or my grandchildren are now going to vote because of the issue of abortion and so on and so forth. And this is a really big question. When it comes to younger people, do we actually see these initiatives have more of an impact, or can it drive more people to vote? Well, we have just very, very little study on this, but here's one of the articles that actually talks about it when we talk about millennials back when they were a little bit younger. So when it comes to the millennial vote, Lacombe and Julish in 2019 went ahead and looked at how ballot measures, especially salient ballot measures, measures that are very important to people, how it impacted the millennial vote. In their conclusion, they found the following. We show that not only do these measures increase millennial voting, but they erase differences in turnout levels between millennials and older generations. This effect is primarily concentrated in low turnout contexts such as midterm elections, indicating that these measures may be playing a similar mobilization role in midterm elections as presidential campaigns do turnout in low propensity voters. So again, it seems to be more of a midterm thing, but it doesn't necessarily seem to be something that might impact the presidential election. It does seem in all of this research that it can be negligible, but even though it's negligible, it could have an impact in a state like Arizona, where it's really close. Now, a state like Florida, where it's a much wider race and we're in a presidential year, it probably won't have that 0.7% turnout effect that we will see. So it does matter as far as how close the election is as to whether these initiatives actually matter or not. Now, there are some holes, I think, or just I haven't been able to find them in regards to this research. And I think these holes are very important to discuss because it really gets to the question that we're asking about how this benefits Democrats or Republicans. So the first big hole that we have in research is that if there is an increase in turnout, which way does that turnout go? Because I think a lot of people just assume if you put the abortion measure on a ballot in a state, you have this 0.7% turnout increase, that 100% of that 0.7 will then vote for the initiative. But we really don't know that. And there hasn't been any political science at all that really determines once that turnout increases, which direction that goes. Now, all the political scientists here, that was not within the scope of their study, so I'm not going to blame them for anything like that. They were primarily looking about turnout in these elections. Now, the second one, and one that I'm kind of surprised there isn't any research that I can find on this, is the overall influence of just the messaging and how initiatives work in partisan elections. So do the initiatives themselves influence partisan change? Now, if we look at Florida back in 2020 and see the ballot measure for the minimum wage and then see how Donald Trump did in the state, it seems like there is no relationship whatsoever. As a matter of fact, when it comes to political science, it seems like Smith's 2005 article about the election in Ohio in 2004 is one of the only ones that kind of connect partisanship to initiatives, and he really didn't see any difference. And it would be great to see a little bit more of this research out there to kind of figure out if these push people in certain ways. So overall, looking at the research, looking at what we can see in the data, in the results or whatnot, I will go ahead and conclude there can be a very, very slight margin of increase in turnout. That is possible, but we still don't know how that turnout goes. So to make any sort of claim that the ballot initiatives that there are in certain states are actually going to impact that election for Kamala Harris, we really can't say. Could it impact the election? Yes, possibly. But we don't know what direction it will impact the election. So when people do talk about ballot initiatives going ahead and pushing out the vote, there's just no evidence that this has a really strong effect on the vote. So this is where I say, hold your horses. We're not even near that, and there's no political science that show any type of major shift when it comes to ballot initiatives influencing partisan elections, especially in presidential years, where it's going to be a higher turnout. Now, it could impact some of the midterm elections. It probably would have been more advantageous for the Democrats in the state of Florida to have this as a ballot measure in 2022 when Ron DeSantis was on the ballot than in 2024 when you have a presidential election in a high turnout year. That could have stimulated Democratic turnout, but overall, we just don't really see that. So thank you all very much for joining me today. This is a little bit of a different video than I usually do. I wanted to delve into the political science aspect of this because a lot of people do ask about the effect that the initiatives might have on vote choice. And when looking at the political science, we really don't see much of an impact. Anything else beyond that is just purely guessing. Even when I look at the 2020 election results in Florida with the minimum wage and Donald Trump, that is purely a guess. I would need to have to go ahead and study that and test it out and whatnot. So anyone saying on the media or whatever that this is going to push the election one way or the other, there's no evidence that that actually happened. So if you like these academically driven videos, I will probably be doing more of these after the election, but I just wanted to do one now to see how it is and see what you think about it. So thank you all very much. Have a wonderful day wherever it is you are, and I will see you in the next video. Bye-bye.